There were male actors I was once very close to, almost like only we understood each other, but then they turned their backs, leaving me in loneliness and secrets I could never speak aloud.
In October 2004, Hollywood was shaken when the Los Angeles Times published excerpts from a diary allegedly belonging to Gary Cooper. These were not the nostalgic reflections of a man recalling a glorious career, nor the fond memories of cinematic triumphs. Instead, the pages revealed something darker, a list of 7 men with whom Cooper had shared secret romantic relationships, men he claimed to despise until his dying day. "Some people kill you with a gun, some kill you with silence," he wrote. "But those men, they used love to squeeze the breath out of me." Who were these men Gary Cooper believed had loved him only to destroy him from the inside out? How did America's most trusted face on the silver screen, calm, steady, and seemingly unshakable, become trapped in a web of passion and betrayal? From the outside, his life appeared untouchable. In 1933, his marriage to New York socialite Veronica Balfe seemed like the perfect Hollywood fairy tale. The ceremony at St. Bartholomew's Church made front-page headlines and graced the cover of Life magazine. To the public, it was a flawless union, a leading man marrying high society's golden girl. Behind closed doors, the reality was far more complicated. Years later, notes leaked from the personal attorney of the Balfe family revealed a truth long hidden from the public. The marriage between Gary Cooper and Veronica Balfe had been carefully negotiated, an arrangement built on image, faith, and power. At the time, Cooper was hounded by quiet but persistent rumors about his sexuality, and he needed a shield. Veronica, intelligent and socially well-positioned, agreed to the union in exchange for lifetime financial security. Only 6 months after the wedding, Cooper was found spending the night at the Beverly Wilshire Hotel with a male Broadway dancer. Records from Lloyd's of London's insurance bureau suggest that Veronica knew but chose not to confront him. Instead, she began keeping meticulous records of every receipt and bill, settling into a marriage where husband and wife lived like shadows of one another. By 1940, Cooper was openly involved with actress Patricia Neal while also meeting in secret with at least 2 male actors, according to the testimony of former detective Fred Och. The press remained silent, but inside Hollywood's inner circles the whispers grew louder. To many in that world, the marriage had never been real. Perhaps it was the constant presence of lies in his private life that drove Cooper to write everything down. In those private pages, he captured words never spoken aloud, loves that could never be named. Among those names, one stood apart. It belonged to the man who once promised to love him forever, yet became the first to turn away, deny everything, and push him into a public relations nightmare. Cary Grant was that man, the commanding presence behind the curtain. Cary Grant was a double-edged blade, smooth and polished in public, razor-sharp in private. Hollywood adored his eyes, his smile, and that refined British charm, half rogue and half gentleman. But Gary Cooper loved him for the parts no one else ever saw, and in the end that proved to be the greatest mistake of his life. In the final months of 1937, they met at a private screening hosted by director George Cukor in his Beverly Hills home. It was not the first time their paths had crossed, but it was the first time they spoke long enough to lose all sense of time. Cary's gaze carried an air of total control while Gary maintained his usual reserve. In that small room with no eyes upon them, the space between them dissolved. A week later, they quietly rented a small house in Silver Lake at the end of Hyperion Avenue where no photographer ever bothered to search. The lease was signed under the name Murray Winters, who was Cary's personal assistant. By day, they were stars from 2 very different worlds. By night, they were simply 2 men living truthfully, sharing a quiet love behind drawn curtains. Veronica still attended public events at Gary's side, but she no longer asked where he went or why he returned home so late. In a letter to her close friend Annabelle Knox in New York, now kept in the Columbia Library archives, she wrote that Gary was still gentle, but he was no longer hers. She admitted she did not know who owned the look in his eyes anymore, but it was not her. Their quiet romance lasted just over a year before it came apart in August 1939. While Gary was in Arizona filming the Westerner, the Los Angeles Examiner ran a front-page story claiming that Gary Cooper was having an affair with an unnamed man, a scandal that sent shockwaves through Paramount. There were no photographs and no names, but the details were alarmingly exact. The Lenta Hotel, the 1937 Packard, the Silver Lake House, all described without a single error. Panic set in and Gary called Carrie in the middle of the night seeking comfort. Instead, he was met with an icy response. Carrie denied knowing what he was talking about and told him bluntly that he would not risk his career over something so reckless. If Gary was going to fall, he would fall alone. Weeks later, Cary Grant sat down with columnist Luella Parsons of the Hearst Syndicate and declared that he pitied those who could not control their private lives. He said he was different, that he always knew the line between reality and performance. Decades later, in 1979, former Examiner editor Philip G. Ross revealed in his memoir that the story had come from an anonymous source within the industry who had supplied every detail of the relationship between Cooper and a top-tier actor. In exchange for $12,000, an unnamed source provided the press with the details that became the scandal's backbone. He could not be named at the time, but was once hailed as the #1 gentleman of the screen, born in Bristol. After the article appeared, Gary and Veronica's marriage nearly collapsed. Veronica fled to New York for 3 months, leaving their daughter Maria in Los Angeles. Gary withdrew from the public eye and rarely left the house. In a letter written in black ink without perfume, he told Carrie that it was not the words that had destroyed him but the silence that followed. He wrote that he had lost his family and his dignity because he believed Carrie believed in their bond, only to discover it had all been an act. In the locked chest Gary kept at his Montana home, Carrie's name never appeared. Instead, there was only a single line calling him the traitor, the first love, the man who sold his soul for 3 lines of press. But Carrie was only the beginning. The next name on Gary's list belonged to the one person he could never resist, the addiction he could not shake. This man stayed close yet never truly committed, drawing nearer the more distant he became, until Gary himself had to sever the bond. That man was Rock Hudson, whom Gary would later describe as the most sophisticated manipulator he had ever known. If Cary Grant had stabbed him in the heart before a world in love with the idea of them, Rock Hudson had poured poison into his glass and made him drink it slowly with a gentle smile. They met in late 1949 during a secret casting session at Universal Studios. Rock was barely past 20, without any significant roles, living on money his mother sent from Illinois and holding only a 6-month studio contract. Gary saw something in Rock he had never found in Cary, a kind of worship. Rock told him on their very first day that he was the reason he had dared to come to Hollywood, that he had even learned to ride a horse just to play a cowboy like Gary. Gary would later call that the sentence that killed him. From that moment he began protecting Rock as one would protect a child, or perhaps as one would love someone who would never truly grow up. They soon moved into a rented house in West Hollywood under the name of Gary's personal assistant. Rock lived there for nearly 3 years, from 1950 until the middle of 1953. During that time, he became the only person who could make Gary both fall deeply in love and doubt himself. Gary believed he was in control of the relationship, but the truth was that Rock guided it with a softness too subtle to be called manipulation and too sweet for Gary to resist. In 1952, Rock began refusing small roles, saying he was tired of playing forgettable characters and wanted to be recognized like Gary. Out of love, Gary personally called director Henry Hathaway to suggest Rock for the film Niagara. The role eventually went to Joseph Cotten, but Rock understood then that Gary would do anything for him. By 1954, Rock Hudson had secured his first major leading role in Magnificent Obsession. Yet before filming began, during a night of heavy drinking, he told Gary that the studio wanted him to maintain a spotless public image. He warned that if any rumors surfaced about his private life, his career would end before it began. Still, things went further than Gary imagined. To protect himself, Rock began quietly spreading whispers that Gary was unstable and abusive. At a Beverly Hills party in early 1954, Rock half-joked to columnist Hedda Hopper that Gary had only two moods, sitting like a statue or smashing things, adding that he had once seen him throw a typewriter because of a line of dialogue he disliked. A week later, The Hollywood Reporter published a headline asking if the cowboy was cracking, quoting unnamed sources who claimed Cooper was showing signs of erratic behavior. Gary did not understand what was happening, but the worst discovery came when he found that bottles of sedatives in his home had been tampered with. He confided to his doctor that he could not remember taking so much medication and that now he could no longer tell the difference between day and night. There were quiet whispers said to come from Rock Hudson's former secretary that he would sometimes slip extra pills into Gary's drinks. It was a way to keep him calm, to stop him from asking questions, to bind him with a possessive love that was both sweet and dangerous. Then in November 1955, Rock suddenly married Phyllis Gates, his agent's secretary. It was a staged wedding and Gary was given no explanation. A week later, Rock appeared on The Steve Allen Show, speaking tearfully about his childhood and poverty and how he had always dreamed of a real family. He said he was lucky to have found a woman who loved him for who he was and not for his screen image. The country was touched, but Gary knew it was a performance designed to erase him from Rock's life. If Rock Hudson had left Gary without direction or faith, the third man was different. This man made Gary believe that he could leave his family and his career and finally live openly. The cost of that belief was total collapse. Anthony Perkins once said in a Cap TV interview that he had grown up watching Gary Cooper on screen. Few knew that when they first met at the Westwood Village screening of Fear Strikes Out in November 1957, the look in Anthony's eyes was not that of a fan. It was the look of a disciple gazing at a saint, ready to pull him down from the altar. His early letters carried an innocence that touched Gary. In one, he asked if the applause ever stopped, would Gary still call his name. According to Gary's personal assistant Walter Ames, within months Anthony was making regular visits to a discreet Santa Monica apartment where Gary retreated from the spotlight. There they cooked breakfast, read together, and loved as though neither had ever been hurt. Gary thought this was a new chapter, gentle and safe, but he had stepped into a labyrinth with no escape. Anthony often spoke of powerful Hollywood names like director Otto Preminger and producer Hal Wallace. Gary stayed silent, not wanting to stand in the way of his lover's ambition. But he began to notice the late-night parties multiplying, the private gatherings on Mulholland Drive where his presence was not requested. When Gary declined to join, Anthony would smile and disappear into the night, returning in the morning with empty eyes and the scent of liquor on his collar. Soon he began weaving Gary into a net of psychological manipulation. Anonymous letters were sent to columnist Luella Parsons describing a veteran star showing signs of psychosis and violent jealousy. Anthony persuaded Gary to handwrite certain notes, later typing them himself, leaving the pages behind in Warner Brothers dressing rooms. By early 1959, forged letters, altered recordings, and missing diary entries began appearing in the hands of gossip columnists like Hedda Hopper and Jimmy Starr, as well as editors at Motion Picture Herald. All arrived in plain envelopes without names. They painted Gary as controlling, domineering, and obsessed with youth. One excerpt sent to Variety caused a sensation. It read that the subject was not just his finest role but the reason he still existed, and that if he were to leave, he would rather die. Gary never wrote such words, yet the punctuation, paragraph breaks, and typing style looked exactly like his. Anthony had replicated them perfectly. The breaking point came in March 1960, only weeks before the premiere of Psycho. An anonymous article claimed Gary had suffered a severe psychological breakdown and had threatened suicide after being abandoned by a young co-star. The producers of The Wreck of the Mary Deer removed his name from the fall casting list. Paramount began to reconsider renewing his 5-year contract. One evening at Musso and Frank, Gary came face to face with Anthony Perkins. Gary looked directly at Anthony and asked a single question: had you ever truly loved me, or was it all just an endlessly stretched out scene from a film? Anthony smiled but said nothing. In that moment, Gary understood that to kill a person you did not necessarily need a gun, only a love long enough and cold enough. The next name on the list was Randolph Scott, the man who hid behind the facade of a perfect lover. At first glance, Randolph embodied the ideal Hollywood man: tall, polite, soft-spoken, always appearing in a crisp white shirt and offering only a refined smile. But beneath that calm surface lay a disturbing habit: collecting people the way others collected scripts, systematically, meticulously, leaving no trace. They met for the first time in 1940 during a screen test for They Died with Their Boots On at Warner Brothers. Neither of them got the part, but as they left the audition room, Randolph turned to Gary and said dryly, "We are better suited as companions in failure than as lonely champions." Gary laughed, and perhaps it was that line that made him fall for someone so eerily similar to himself yet utterly different. 3 months later, Gary moved in with Randolph at a secluded Silver Lake villa. Life at first was like a dream, far from the press lights. They cooked, played tennis, read scripts, and wrote imaginary dialogue never meant for the screen. But one night, Gary woke at 3 a.m. to the faint clicking sound from the wardrobe. It was not a mouse, it was a running tape recorder. From that moment, everything changed. Randolph began to know far too much, even things Gary had never spoken aloud, like the time he sat alone on the porch, typing on the machine Randolph had given him, and wrote the line, "I wish he knew how to hurt the way I hurt." Later, Gary discovered the typewriter had been fitted with a tracking device and special carbon paper that copied every word, every punctuation mark, keeping it all as if preparing for a script. In 1944, Randolph released Under the Floorboards, a psychological tragedy about a young actor slowly falling into hallucinations, loving a powerful man, and then destroying himself, unable to tell love from manipulation. The film won the Golden Globe for Best Original Screenplay, but the man sitting alone in a private screening room, rolling up his sleeves to hide the trembling in his hands, was the one the story was based on: Gary Cooper. Every line of dialogue, every letter, every private memory of his had been used without permission, without credit, without thanks. When the protagonist in the film knelt in the middle of the room, looked up, and said, "If I am wrong, then write me again," Gary stood, left the theater, and never spoke of it again. Afterward, he vanished from Los Angeles for a long while. In 1947, when he returned to the set of Unconquered, his eyes had changed, no longer as clear as before. Few knew that the first person to call him after his disappearance was a man with a sad smile, someone who had nearly died twice from mixing alcohol and sleeping pills, and who had loved Gary like the last flame in a burning desert, Montgomery Clift. Gary once whispered to co-star Joel McCrea, "Monty loves with his whole body, but when he hates, he uses his whole mind, and I never know which side I'm on." They met in the spring of 1951 at a private party hosted by director George Cukor. Gary was then struggling to escape the long shadow of Cary Grant, while Monty had just been named by Life magazine as Marlon Brando's most dangerous rival. Monty saw Gary from across the room, shoulders straight but slightly bowed, eyes still as water before a storm, and said, "I know that look. It once lived in my mirror." 2 weeks later, Gary left his Wilshire apartment and moved in with Monty at a secluded Big Sur estate, hidden deep in the woods with no phone signal, no neighbors, and no way out. Monty called it a place of healing. For Gary, it became a psychological laboratory, one where he was no longer a man, but a subject of emotional study. Monty demanded absolute isolation, burning Gary's address book, cutting the phone line, and instructing the housekeeper to accept only notes signed by him. In the evenings, they ate in silence, after which Monty would project Gary's old films and sit behind him, whispering like a hypnotist, "Do you love the man in that movie? Or are you just repeating a dream that never existed?" At first, it was a question. Then it became a demand. Finally, it turned into an order. When Gary resisted, Monty did not shout or break things. Instead, he played a recording of Gary's voice speaking about loneliness, fear, and the moments when he wanted to disappear, recorded by a hidden device planted inside the old typewriter Gary had brought with him. Whenever they argued, Monty forced Gary to kneel before a heavy silver-framed mirror in the living room and read aloud a monologue Monty had written, "Who am I if I am not loved by a man like you?" One night, Gary tried to leave, packing quietly at 2 in the morning. But when he opened his suitcase, a small device inside played Monty's pre-recorded voice, "If you walk out of here, every role you ever play will be nothing but an empty shell." Gary did not leave. He did not destroy the device. He simply stood in the dark until morning. 6 months in Big Sur passed like a slow collapse, until his close friend William Holden found him and took him back to Los Angeles. Gary had lost more than 50 pounds, his eyes sunken, and throughout the trip he spoke only one sentence: "I no longer know if I am living in someone else, or if someone else is living in me." Monty denied everything. In Modern Screen magazine, he said, "Sometimes people confuse love with possession. I have never done that." In a notebook he left behind, there was only a single page written in red ink: "I once loved a mirror, but I made the mistake of throwing it to the ground, and that mirror shattered, just as it had once reflected the truest parts of Gary Cooper." Gary Cooper's later life was marked by a series of intense, tragic relationships that stripped away the cold armor he wore on screen. With Tab Hunter, he experienced a spark that made him believe that fearless love was possible. Their time together in 1957 was filled with furtive moments, behind closed-door laughter, and a dangerous sense of freedom in a world that demanded silence. But jealousy, the pressures of public life, and Tab's sudden engagement to a woman left Cooper feeling abandoned, as if the air had been taken from his lungs. With James Dean, the bond was even deeper, two souls who understood each other's constant loneliness. They talked about life outside of Hollywood, quietly planned to live a public life one day, and shared intimate nights that Gary would never forget. But in 1955, a car accident ended Dean's life abruptly, leaving Cooper with an empty heart that never left. In his private writings, he later confessed that Dean's loss was the moment he stopped believing that love could save him. Do you think Gary Cooper's grief shaped the way the world saw him on screen, or was it just a secret he kept to himself? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to like and subscribe to this article if it touched you.